possible. Specifically here at UVic, we acknowledge the Lekwungen and the Wasanich nations who have a perpetual relationship to this place, and we commit to the ongoing work of truth-telling and reconciliation. So the John Albert Hall has been a joint offering between the Anglican Diocese and the Center for Studies in Religion and Society since 1996. Which goes back quite a ways. And in the steering committee, we aim to bring speakers and themes and topics at the mutual intersection between interests of the diocese and the academic community here at UVic. And so we're grateful for the John Albert Hall Trust that enables these lectures to happen. And we've been looking forward to this evening for quite some time. So I'm grateful again for you all being here to join us, and I'll turn it over to Paul Bramadat, the director of the CSRS, to introduce tonight's lecture.
Thanks, Brendan. Hello and good evening, everyone, and thanks to Brendan for bringing the greetings of the diocese. I'm Paul, and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. I'm pleased to be involved in yet another collaborative event that combines the resources and interests of the Secular Academy in the local Anglican community. Over the last roughly 20 or so years, the John Albert Hall Partnership has brought to Victoria a couple dozen scholars, clergy, and activists, people from Noam Chomsky to Chris Hedges, to Kwok Pui Lam, to Pamela Clausen, to Essie Adujian. It's been an exciting journey so far, and we continue tonight. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Linn Tonstad into this John Albert Hall tradition. Dr. Tonstad completed her PhD at Yale University in 2019, and in 2012, she started teaching there. Since 2020, she's been an associate professor of theology, religion, and sexuality at the Yale Divinity School. She's also a professor in Yale's religious studies program. Dr. Tonstad has established herself as a leading scholar of theology, gender, ethics, and their intersections with contemporary society. In her book, God and Difference, The Trinity, Sexuality, and the Transformation of Finitude, published in 2016, she challenges readers to rethink traditional theological frameworks with a special interest in promoting a more radical vision of the relationship between the divine and the human. In her Queer Theology, Beyond Apologetics, published in 2018, she focuses on LGBTQ+ experiences and urges a more sophisticated dialogue between queer theory and theological inquiry. She also writes very beautifully about many other topics, not least of which is what I might call the theology of dance culture, specifically rave culture, in which the dancer's proximity to other bodies, other fellow sufferers, can create a space for deep reflection. I saw some of this last night as she addressed the inclusive Christians community here on campus. All that to say, I think we're in for a real treat tonight. Now, a quick word about the format of this evening. After Linn speaks for about 40 minutes, she'll enter into conversation with our UVic friend and colleague, Dr. Aaron Devor, a professor of sociology and director of UVic's Transgender Archives. That discussion will last for about 20 minutes, after which we'll spend about half an hour or so in broad conversation, which I will moderate. And so now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Linn Tonstad to UVic.
So I guess the two things I'll start off by saying before we actually dive in, I got increasingly nervous over the last half hour, so I'm just going to put that forward. And in the direction I decided to go today, I tried to err on the side of trying to do some big picture things. There's going to be a lot of things we could potentially talk about, I hope, so feel free to be like, where was that, or what was coming there when we get into the discussion. All right. So much for the apologies, so to speak. Shall we go? It is, of course, practically axiomatic that the one thing queerness and Christianity have in common is that they're both about inclusion, and that the acid solution to their notoriously knotted intersections is that the latter, Christianity, must learn to include the former, queerness. The seemingly ever-growing cottage industry of books on Christianity and queerness even contains entries that go yet further, asserting the intrinsic queerness of Christianity. Even contributions that stop short of so redemptive a step tend to make claims verging on the grandiose about the radical potential for queerness to transform Christianity, if only Christianity learns to include its queer and trans others. We could, of course, in a hoist with their own petard kind of move, ask how its capacity to include its others became the solution to the acknowledged problems of Christian imperialism. But even in my most irritable moments, I do my best to avoid such easy reversals, or at least to avoid imagining that they do more than point to an area where a possible problematic might invite further examination. But before we start digging into some very knotty questions together, a moment of clarification. As a queer theologian who works on Christianity and queer theory, my work uses two distinct but related senses of queer. One is as a term for the people who sort ourselves in some way under the ever-expanding umbrella of LGBTQIA, embarrassed, etc., not all of whom, of course, self-identify as queer. The other comes from a strand in queer thinking, queer life worlds, and queer activism that might be thought of as an anti-assimilationist position, or as a political position that is, in the words of Black theorist Cathy Cohen, about a relation to power. I will not usually note which sense predominates at which point in the talk, though I'd be happy to talk about that in discussion. One more thing, you, whoever you may or may not recognize yourself or the world at various points in the talk. And that may not recognize, is central, even necessary, to the fundamental thrust of my argument today. And then a content note. As is appropriate in a talk on queer theology, some of the language that follows is more explicit than is typical of most academic talks. There will be sex, in other words. An alternative title for this talk might have been On How Difficult It Is to Love the Flesh. Let us briefly trace Christianity's notorious difficulties with the body, or what I increasingly prefer to call the flesh. For the body might be something one has, but we don't have flesh, we are flesh. Flesh that breathes, moves, responds, and dies. To be flesh is unavoidable and also difficult. To be flesh is to be vulnerable to whatever surrounds us, to what we love as much as to what might kill us. Christianity, of course, has this notoriously ambivalent relationship to flesh. Even though in contrast to many other movements at its original time, Christianity affirmed the fittingness of flesh for human being, because it affirmed the resurrection of the flesh, it was marked also by three kinds of ambivalence in relation to flesh. The first we might call flesh's unruliness. The second, its appetites. And the third, its impermanence. Flesh's unruliness, as Augustine famously and amusingly speculated, was best symbolized by the incapacity of penis-having persons to control their erections, to produce them on command and dismiss them when no longer desired, which of course he saw as a clear sign of our collective expulsion from the Garden of Eden and shared inheritance of original sin. You may have known that, you may not. Second, flesh's appetites for food, sex, violence, and play reflect our animality. They are not as distinctive to us as human beings. And they need, so Christianity says, and so we might say also in somewhat different terms, to be properly ordered for human existence to be possible and meaningful. Here we might remind ourselves that the condition of possibility for how we live is our learned capacity to choose when and where to shit. And third, flesh's impermanence, most easily seen in that the best imaginable outcome of a happy relationship is you get to watch your beloved die. In other words, there's a reason this story is a little bit complex, or maybe many reasons. On the one hand, Christianity comes to be out of a belief in the irreversibility of God's commitment to the flesh. Yet that belief attaches most strongly to the resurrection of the flesh, which involves an idea of flesh that does not have an end, an idea irrelevant to any flesh we know. But why am I even tarrying with Christianity's relation to flesh? Haven't we all, in our increasingly knowledgeable relations to science, faith, ethics, gender, sexuality, moved far beyond these ambivalences? Haven't even liberal Christians today at least learned to love the body with a radically inclusive love, including also those whose experiences and practices of the life of flesh are different than our own? to love and welcome everyone, except, of course, those people, the ones who, unlike us, don't care about others, don't love everyone, and don't accept those who are different from themselves. And here, since I figured I should say a little something about the title that I gather caused some concern for folks, we are already at one of the most straightforward reasons why my work avoids setting up inclusion as an ethical standard. Inclusion is produced by distinction from the non-inclusive other. The strand of queer theology in which I work is concerned to oppose such distinction-making. But the ideal of inclusion tends also to avoid some of the biggest difficulties engendered by the ambiguity of flesh, difficulties that have been tragically highlighted by the fundamental irreconcilability of different needs during the second pandemic that is not over. And in avoiding those difficulties, the ideal of inclusion covers over and makes invisible its own violence, what queer theorist Lee Edelman calls the violence of the good in their goodness. The violence of the good in their goodness is, I think, one of the most dangerous kinds of violence because it conceals itself through denying its own violence. It is violence that says there is no alternative. The violence that says there is no way to live peacefully together except by eradicating the dangerous terrorist other. The violence that puts faith in reason, the hallmark of the university, of expert knowledge, and of the liberal humanism that imagines us as intentional actors freely choosing between different options for how we should be. I did cut the section on the ambiguities of theology in the university, but I'm telling you that so we could talk about it if we wanted to. Queer theology, as I undertake it, emerges from one strand of the tradition of writing known as queer theory, the origin of which is usually dated to writings published between about 1987 and 1993 in the United States, at the height of that other pandemic that is not over. In a moment when our capacity to hate flesh's ability to betray us was on full display, when that hatred was enacted in antagonism towards vulnerable, dying flesh, queer theorists asked what we could learn from what was happening, how we could understand it. What they asked could engender the rhetorical derision and the refusal of embrace that met the once beautiful flesh of persons with AIDS. Refusing to stop by giving the phenomenon a name, homophobia, queer theorists probed deeper. In an era marked by political divergence, struggles around identity, and deep public anxiety around the threat of illness and improperly ordered gender and sexuality, they refused to accommodate the sensible liberalism of their day. As I sat inside listening to the sirens ceaselessly wailing the dirge of death in New York City in March 2020, it was to these writers that I turned. But we're getting a little ahead of the story. The SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has overshadowed our lives so differently, not only through its rising and falling temporalities, but especially in the often contradictory sufferings and losses that it has imposed. A worldwide respiratory pandemic is simultaneously global and hyperlocal. Its trajectory depends on a host of variables about which we know something, but not yet enough. Contingencies, new introductions, superspreading events, the cultural dynamics of physical proximity, mores around talking on public transportation that are either unpredictable or only roughly and retrospectively calculable. Race, class, living situation, occupation, citizenship or lack thereof, gender and health status modulate the age-determined J-shaped curve of COVID-19 mortality, so that across almost every dimension, control measures and failures of control both impose greater risk and sacrifice on the relatively more vulnerable. That's what it means to be relatively more vulnerable. The pandemic confronted us with situations in which there were no good options, only bad or worse. And the failure of good political solutions in many rich countries generated public sentiments that individualized and moralized responsibility for the virus's transmission. Pandemic deniers and vaccine refusers join climate change deniers as incarnations of the careless, amoral other whose indifference to the lives of others leads to death. Someone somewhere is not wearing a mask. That murderously indifferent grandma-killing COVIDiot cares nothing for others. unlike those of us who never let our masks slip below our noses. Someone somewhere is eating inside a restaurant. I order takeout and tip generously. Someone somewhere is gathering with others in backyards, at parks, on beaches, carelessly and blithely having fun while others are dying, as if that were not also the truth of every moment of our lives. In this house, we believe the science. How convenient it has been to have a way easily to distinguish those who care about other people from those who don't. Someone somewhere held a wedding, someone somewhere traveled to see their family for a holiday, someone somewhere celebrated a religious occasion in person, someone somewhere allowed a child to hug an aging grandparent. Such reckless behavior shows how little they care about others. Don't they know we're in a global pandemic? There are two kinds of people, those who care about others and those who don't. Those who are willing to make even the smallest sacrifices for others and those who are not. This is the voice of what I call pandemic anthropology. And while the examples I have just used reflect, of course, the context of the United States, especially in its more liberal areas, there is one particular example from Canada that stands out. In the name of care, in the name of safety, in the name of the good, many elderly people in Canada were confined to their care homes. Some of them disallowed from going outside for well over a year. Many of them were left alone in there, or very nearly. And worst of all, some of them died alone. I know you know this. We may not want to remember, but we must, that solitary confinement is a form of torture. We have done all this in the name of the good. And as we keep insisting our acts, unlike theirs, these figural others of our desire for our own goodness, have been motivated by reason, by compassion, by care for the suffering of others. That our compassionate acts have also caused suffering is irrelevant. Because unlike them, selfish and narcissistic as they are, we care about others. We reject the selfishness of those others who have no empathy with what others are going through. That is the problem that the writings of these queer theorists take up. As we know now, during a respiratory pandemic that spreads prior to symptoms and has a primarily age-determined mortality curve in which supply chains must be kept running, for they are the means by which we distribute life and death, and in which the risks of long COVID are unequally distributed, the needs and sacrifices of the relatively more and the relatively less vulnerable cannot be reconciled, even if we pretend that we can know exactly how to calculate who finds themselves in which category. In a pandemic where needs genuinely conflict, losses cannot be fairly redistributed, even by the most heroic acts of renunciation or desire. And it is not the case that if others just cared about others, the losses of the pandemic would have been avoided. Because one of the ways some people care about others is by embracing them. Already before the pandemic, I had an almost fanatical attachment to and interest in Eve Sedgwick's first axiom in her influential epistemology of the closet, an axiom one could call the first axiom of queer theory, one that a queer studies friend of mine has tattooed on his body. It reads no less insightful to me now than when I first encountered it a couple decades ago, yet very simple. People are different from each other. It is astonishing how few respectable conceptual tools we have for dealing with this self-evident fact. If I have a life project, and I do, it's grounded in an ongoing devotional commitment to understanding to the point of failing to understand, because only there can something like understanding really begin, living into and accepting this discomforting fact that different things mean different things to different people. Different things are important to different people. It's discomforting and unavoidable. And we could add to that another axiom taken from Avery Gordon's wonderful Ghostly Matters, that life is complicated may seem a banal expression of the obvious, but it is, she says, nonetheless a profound theoretical statement, perhaps the most important theoretical statement of our time. People are different from each other. The same acts don't mean the same things to different people. How hard that is to accept, especially in pandemic time. Through the tireless and exhausted labor of activist thinkers, we learned from the HIV/AIDS crisis to recognize the phobic and homophobic aspects of representations of the careless, disease-spreading other. In the face of demands for quarantine, tracing, public disclosure, and permanent abstinence, they fought for harm reduction, the non-determination of social participation by health status, the value of creative promiscuity, and the political significance of pleasure. One of the biggest influences on my work, the highly controversial and sometimes very irritating queer theorist Lee Edelman, is one of those writers. In an essay originally published in 1992, Edelman describes how writing by gay AIDS activists generated a contemptuous depiction of non-activist gay men as narcissists addicted to pleasure, resistant to struggle, and therefore themselves responsible for the ongoingness of suffering, including their own. But, Edelman argues, if we take up the vision of agency that the activist position was insisting on, a vision of agency that reflects the values of the liberal state's vision of politics, it might not do much to protect those who are targeted as relatively less valuable by those same political visions. So instead of valorizing only heroic activist actions, he suggests talking about what we might call a passive agency. An agency, and this is a slightly long quote, but I'll be using the keywords, I think, 3 times, so I think we'll get it. He suggests a passive agency that acknowledges its inescapable participation in the production of social effects, while acknowledging its inability to control the effects in whose production it thereby figures. Such a notion, he says, would require the recognition that powerfully political effects can be generated even by those who would seem from an activist perspective to be or anti-political. Interesting though Edelman's notion of agency is here, what keeps me coming back to these lines is that inescapable participation with an inability to control pairing, which rings a hard tone in the face of what we hope politics and our best intentions can do for us. In the midst of a global pandemic of unrepresentable complexity, and as people keep reminding us, rightly so, it is not over, in which very nearly everyone alive will encounter the virus, our participation in the production of social effects alongside our inability to control those effects hurts, with its simple statement of what's real. Pandemics are periods of the intensification of the ambiguity of fleshy life, that what we live by might and eventually will also kill us. The means by which we have sought to control this pandemic, and I am not contesting the necessity of those means, are unprecedented at this scale. In trying to protect each other, we have also done violence. In trying to protect each other, we have also stigmatized those who made choices different from our own, regardless of what those choices might have meant to those who made them. And in that kind of stigmatizing, we will always tell ourselves, this time it's different, this time it's urgent, this time we're hitting the right people. But at the heart of queer theology and a certain strand of queer theory, as I understand it, is the denial of the possibility of doing that. We will never get our targets right. Our moralizing will never pick out the genuinely bad people in contrast to the innocent, even if we think such categories do obtain. Especially when the matter of guilt or innocence is the matter of breath, of life, of flesh. For all of us know not what we do. Queer theology, then, is a theology of and for pandemic times. It is a theology of flesh, flesh that withers and dies, slaps and embraces, that dances and mourns, that invades and defends, that thinks and sleeps and imagines, that feels desire and love and aversion, hatred and fear. It is a theology that accepts how hard it is to love the flesh, especially in the moments when flesh's ambivalence confronts us. It is a theology that thrives when we pay attention to what is and might be, and withers when we reject the world for what it is not. It is, in short, a theology for this moment. I want to suggest then that queer theory and theology will not give us what we want from them, and that is their real value. They are for living somewhat less violently with what we cannot and should not bear, for living somewhat less violently with what we cannot and should not bear, but will bear anyway, whether we want to or not, for such is the life of flesh. The negative ethics that I think is their especial terrain is one that refuses social, political, ethical, and theological visions in which the tension and friction of difference, not difference in its lovable versions, but in the sense of conflict, is imagined as overcomable, even in theory. In other words, queer theory and theology, I'm suggesting, are not for inclusion. They are for learning to live with the threat of otherness, even when it is a genuine threat. And they are even for pandemic times, for the times when we let people die alone, unembraced, for fear of what their flesh might do to our flesh. The times when in the name of the protection of innocent and vulnerable flesh, we do violence to other flesh. In other words, for the times when our violence and our goodness are inextricable from each other. On March 30, 2020, I finished a draft of a short piece for the inaugural edition of the Against Nature Journal, which was dedicated to exploring the role of religion in the making of that which is against nature, namely sodomy. Because I'd been in Norway for some lectures in early March and returned on the second to last flight to quarantine in New York, I had at that point not interacted with anyone outside the home for 18 days. That seemed like a long time then. The piece was titled A Queer We, and the question mark is very important. A queer we, question mark. I'm going to share just some short excerpts from it. To preserve the possibility of we have had to distance ourselves from each other in the ways that matter most. In this time, life together means bodily life apart. But life apart is for the sake of life together. Without life together, life apart is not life. Queer, the identity, can always form a we by distinction and distance. We're not like those queers over there. We're not a threat. We're good citizens or good Christians or good people who simply want to love our families, for love is love. But queer, the political position, cannot form a we in the same way. As a political position, a queer we forms around those who have had the choice made for them, the unassimilable. It stands with those who don't have the choice to conform or to belong, not with those whose nonconformity can be turned on or off at will. And as a political position, queer is not a romantic idea of individual resistance, but a finding of oneself alongside others who never had the option to walk through the door of inclusion, respectability, and access to political power of certain kinds. The formation of a we always inaugurates a they, or perhaps emerges from a they. A queer we, therefore, has to be formed aslant. It cannot come from sameness, inclusion, or recognition. Because a queer we takes shape against the systems that produce sameness, inclusion, and recognition as their only possible ideals, and in so doing, exclude. A queer we refuses the demands of respectability and productivity, even though some queers want those same ideals. Therefore, a queer we is not inclusive. It knows that enmity and antagonism are real. A queer we reflects an ethics in which antagonism is never overcome. A queer we knows that life together includes death and loss, for the body that lives is the body that dies. And because death is the necessary end, a queer we fights and grieves and works for the life of the flesh that is so much more than survival, more than merely going on. Instead of reproducing what already is, a queer we seeks to find more. As queer theologian Marcella Althaus Reed puts it, queers are searching for God's nipples and soft lips, and trying to bite them in oblique ways in order to discover some oblique transcendence in their lives. And so we become a queer we, a we of strangers and the estranged. I did not know when I sent off this short reflection that it outlined the themes I would be thinking with for the next 4 years. Instead, I went for a walk along the East River where I received a phone call from my dean informing me that I had just received tenure at Yale. I would not set foot on campus for the next year and a half. And because of the negativity, I acknowledge it, of the kind of position that I've been taking, in so many of the talks I've been giving in recent years, I've been asked, if not this, then what? If not inclusion, not goodness, then what? I've always answered that I'm much less interested in the good than I am in the possibility of the better, in the possibility of somewhat less violence. But recently, I've come to acknowledge that I will have to say more. So I'm going to try a very short version of that out with you today for the first time. In the community of those who have nothing in common, that's the title of the book, The Community of Those Who Have Nothing in Common, Alfonso Lingus writes, I came to think that a society that would forsake the dying to die alone, whether in hospitals or in the gutters, undermines itself radically. Borrowing language from him, as well as from Lee Edelman's assertion that his queer theory promises nothing, I call this the ethics of those who have nothing in common. In his influential Cruising Utopia, Jose Esteban Munoz looks for an alternative that might interrupt the stranglehold of straight time. His sources include a variety of concrete utopias following Ernst Bloch, including the queer utopian memory of the ghosts of gay male public sex cultures. In one of the many memorable passages in that wonderful text, Munoz picks up poet John Giorno's account of fucking artist Keith Haring in the Prince Street subway toilets in 1982. Munoz quotes Giorno on that encounter at some length, emphasizing that Giorno's narration idealizes, but he says it always also brings with it a powerful political impulse. In Giorno's epically translucent depiction, and this is going to be a quote, of shooting a big load of cum, straight and glorious, perfectly arisen and accomplished and perfectly dissolved back into primordially yet pure empty space, Munoz finds, he says, a picture of utopian transport and a reconfiguration of the social, a reimagining of our actual conditions of possibility in the face of a global epidemic. After the scene in which Giorno comes, Munoz recounts Giorno's shock at returning to the world of the grim everyday as the subway train arrives. And he connects that scene to Munoz's own feelings, first reading this scene in an ordinary coffee shop, transported to glorious, and looking up to find himself once more within the gray world of the everyday. Munoz notes that Giorno's fantasies of rapturous, unsafe sex might have a damaging effect on gay men living in the AIDS pandemic, but finds something enabling there nonetheless. But between the two scenes that Munoz recounts, Giorno's orgasm after fucking Haring and his come down as he catches the train, Giorno includes another scene, as well as a good deal of fascinating and scene-setting detail. Giorno is a real gossip. You can read either of his possibly slightly exaggerated memoirs. Again, this is going to be a long description. After I came, I rested in his arms for a while. The kid pressed his dick against me and obviously wanted to come too. I sucked his cock and I wished he'd come so I could stop doing it. I got up and kissed him and tried to jerk him off, but he gently pressed my shoulder for me to go down. He wanted to come in my mouth. I couldn't have felt less like doing it, but this kid was special and I wanted to give him back something he really wanted. Gagging, I kept at it. He came in a flood of thick, gooey cum that oozed from my lips as I swallowed. In 1982, I knew very well about AIDS, but I thought this kid has such pure intentions. How could he have AIDS? On the next page, we learn that when Giorno gave Keith the blowjob, Keith was HIV positive. Indeed, as Giorno tells the tale, Haring already suspected that he had contracted the virus based on a line from his diary. But instead of charging Haring with his dangerous, irresponsible pandemic denial that put Giorno at risk for the sake of Haring's selfish pleasure, Giorno says this: I have always remembered that anonymous kid for opening himself so extraordinarily, for allowing a great moment of fabulous transcendent sex, motivated by genuine love, trying to radiate enough compassion to fill the world. You may be able to tell that Giorno spent much of the 70s in India as well. That picture of compassion, idealized in its own way, is nonetheless rather different from the violence of the good in their goodness that we have been discussing. It is not an ethics that we can responsibly recommend. We might even call it an impossible ethics. I will mention, though not go into, that one might also describe the ethical vision that emerges from the innocent victim who goes quietly to the place of sacrifice as an impossible ethics. People have given up so much to protect each other in this time, although I do know that it was a different experience in New York than it was here. Yet many who are invested in practices of care and solidarity have experienced pandemic time not as care but as carelessness, not as solidarity but as helplessness in the face of the indifference of others. Indeed, even right now, many of us find our own suffering unheard and unacknowledged. Or maybe we can't understand why others won't join us in acting on climate catastrophe, in working to end incarceration, in seeking a ceasefire. What, if anything, might make us even want to hear each other? Once upon a time, to come out did not refer to coming out of the closet, an arguably individual act of self-declaration. In its earliest usages, as gay historians have documented, it meant coming out into the life with others that the cessation of concealment involved. I've been asked on the street of New York by older gay men sometimes, my partner and myself, are you in the life? So there is still a trace of that usage remaining in some places. And of course, one can be queer and trans all by oneself. But queer and trans life worlds require other people. What if we came out into the life together? Indeed, I'm suggesting that when we come out into the life of those who have nothing in common, into the life of the rest of us, to borrow Jeremy Linn's claim that sometimes everyone means the rest of us, we might find something we did not expect. We might be surprised by the others. So let me then, as we near the end, briefly retell the story of the pandemic one last time. We tried. The task was impossible. The task we attempted was one of unprecedented, gorgeous, and dangerous hubris undertaken for the sake of protecting self and other. It involved staying away from each other as an expression of care and solidarity. And although what we tried to do was ultimately impossible, the global and local attempts at virus control need to be looked at not only from the perspective of the shoddy solutions that were on offer from those who anointed themselves experts, but from the perspective of those who were, even if imperfectly, part of a fleshy global practice of solidarity at a collective scale that may never have been attempted before. And each of us was and maybe is just one small contributor to that attempt. In other words, this is the story of those who wore masks some of the time, who got vaccinated eventually, who picnicked in parks instead of holding dinners at home, who held fewer parties, who gave up the presence of others for weeks instead of months, whose masks slipped below their noses, who wore them alone in the car driving to the restaurant but took them off to sit at the table and put them on again to walk to the bathroom, who wore them alone outside trudging down a snowy street, who tested once, twice, 3 times when they had a sniffle, even those who castigated others for their risk-taking while not quite acknowledging how they were really living their own lives. All these attempts, I'm suggesting, could be recognized and thanked, even in their imperfection. For those whose trust in others has understandably been broken by this encounter with the careless, indifferent other, might it offer some solace to hear that people really tried? That what was being given up wasn't haircuts, but many of the activities around which people shape their lives, that we gave life to protect life? In his book, Inciting Joy, Ross Gay notes that we have come to mistakenly separate joy and sorrow, But he says, what if joy, instead of refuge or relief from heartbreak, is what effloresces from us as we help each other carry our heartbreaks? He describes hangs, and now my students are telling me that my use of hangs is a generational thing, so here we are, you get older every day. He describes hangs at which people come and stay and laugh and cry, and says, our fun breaks what once broken might never again be fixed, namely our not being together, at which point they know they're doomed. What might happen if we are changed by each other, if fun allows us to hear each other's heartbreak, or if heartbreak, sorrow, and joy are not so distinct as we have come to think, if joy also matters? What might happen if we are changed by each other? Gay tells us they know that laughter is a contagion. Those who laugh are its vectors. And one of laughter's qualities is that it can draw us together by reminding us of the breath we share, which also reminds us, or can, especially when we fall off our chairs, when we gasp for air, as we sometimes do, of the dying we share, which is a pretty big thing to share when you think about it, maybe one of the biggest. And if we share that, why not share everything else? It could be epidemic, this sharing, which is why they tried to nip it in the bud. Among the most fraught objects in the study of religion is the idea of collective effervescence, that people might be tied together and become more. Among the most fraught objects in queer theory is good feeling. Among the most fraught objects in Protestant theology is the capacity, or lack thereof, of the finite for the good. Finitum non capax infinitum, the finite is not capable of the infinite, obviously. But finitude is so much more than our poor measurements of it, our calculations of blame and deservingness. For we are more together than we are apart. The more that we are is also nothing. But nothing is all we are and have, and sometimes that's more than enough. Thank you.
Check. There we go. Thanks very much, Lynn. That was wonderful. So now I get to sort of just lightly, as it were, lubricate this conversation. Now I'm very mindful of such metaphors. This part of the conversation. Yeah. I'm just going to say this is probably the first time such language was used in a John Orwell Hall talk, and thank you. I'm going to turn it over first to Aaron. I'm not sure if these microphones are...
Is it on?
Ah.
It is on.
Okay,
Good.
Go ahead.
All right, that's your introduction. Okay.
Yep, that's like a...
Very short introduction.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I mentioned that Aaron is a good friend of the center, professor of sociology, former dean of grad studies, and the director of the Transgender Archives.
Chair in Transgender Studies.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. There's my introduction. So thank you for a very interesting and wide-ranging talk. I do not have a background in theology. And so at some places I have to say, well, I'm having a little trouble following where we're going. So I wanted to start with a question of, explain to me about the Christianity of the talk that you just gave, all right? Because that's not my field. And so I'd like you to take me in and explain to me how this is connected to Christian theology.
So I did purposefully leave some of that a little bit implicit, knowing that theology tends to be a fairly fraught object in the university here as well. And that in religious studies, the game of hunt the theologian is the most popular sport we can undertake. And you can always find the theologian somewhere because, of course, Protestantism contributed to shaping the world that we inhabit. So the theological is, I'm not going to go back and spell it because I did purposefully leave it a bit indirect.
Okay.
What would I say in addition to that, though? The theology here, I guess the one thing I will say that is very explicitly theological is one that recognizes that the thing that comes to be called Christianity was not initially intended for living well in the world.
You've left me hanging.
Yeah.
Okay, so the way you think about that, right? If you go through the kind of arguments around apocalypticism in Paul, right, and in particular the kind of cancellations of binaries in which, the form of this world is passing away, right? Then the idea is that there is something that is radically changing in the world, that the old forms of life no longer uphold, that this is not a way to live well in the world, but instead a way to potentially move away from discourses of self-protection and specifically from the production of the sort of practice of producing a distinction between, of producing distinctions. Now, there are some real difficulties with that as well because of the historical trajectory that this ended up taking, right? This is unfortunately also the origin of Christian supersessionism, right? And so I don't want to take that on in any unqualified way, but there is a sort of deep and fairly obvious theological that lies in here. You could also run this through talking about God as nothing, because God is, as I say, to extreme exhaustion in my Intro to Theology lectures, God is not a being among other beings or a thing among other things. Because God is not defined by God's differences from what is other than God. God is beyond that kind of difference, beyond difference, difference beyond difference in a way you might say. If God were defined by God's difference from what is other than God, then God would be limited by God's difference from what is other than God. So I can run some fairly technical theological versions of this. I can run versions where talking about God is also talking about the nothingness, that is the generosity, that is the infinite mystery at the heart of the universe. Or talk about creation as suspension over nothing, where nothing is not a threat, not an other, not a danger or a lack, but nothing. But again, I chose not to do that for a reason.
So you've just done it a little bit, and it's brought to mind a scholar that I'm familiar with who is a Jewish scholar by the name of Joy Layden. Mm-hmm. She's a trans person. She teaches or taught at Yeshiva University. You know Yeshiva University, you're from New York.
I wrote one of the responses to her book in TSQ.
Okay, good. So you may recall that there's a section where she talks about when she was young, before she came to her trans identity and was living at that point as a boy, she felt like nobody could see her and nobody could understand her. And she felt very alone in the world, and she felt that her true identity was hidden and invisible. And she writes about how she took comfort in her understanding, her childish understanding of God, because God was not seen and not possible to understand. And so to her, that was comfort, because there was someone, something, some other entity somewhere in the universe that was like her, because she felt like she was the only one that was unseen, unknown. And so I thought of that as you were just answering my question. So thank you. I mean,
it's also a lovely image, because one of the ways that thinking about humans as the image of God ends up getting read. I'm just gonna try and stop that ringing.
Point the microphone to your chest.
Oh, is that what I need to do? Thank you. I'm like, tra-la-la, here we go, okay. One of the ways that the image of God language gets used in the history of Christian thought is incomprehensibility, right? That the image of God in humans might be something like that humans can be reformed in any number of shapes, all of which in some way participate in God. But you don't have to read it that way.
Right, the Jewish concept's a little different. But I'm not here to be the Jewish theologian, but B'Tselem Elohim is one of our concepts. And of course, it's a little more concrete than what you just described. But for Joy Layden, it was quite abstract, and it really worked for her. I want to talk to you a little bit about, you talked about queer in many different ways, in many different ways that we might understand queer. And at one point, I thought what you were saying, and you'll bring me back to it because there were a lot of different ways you talked about it, that it was about how we are all different, and there is a politics, and there is an identity. And you veered away from the identity part and went into the politics part. And you seem to be saying that queer was about all those people that don't belong anywhere else and are on the outside. Let me see if I got to, the community of those who have nothing in common. So I'd like you to explain a little bit more, talk a little bit more about how you can have a community, a sense of community, when we have nothing in common. So maybe you could go into that a little more.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And there's a sort of historical version, I would say, of an answer. And then there's a kind of, you would probably consider it more abstract version of an answer. I'll do the abstract one first. I think we have nothing in common, right? I really do think that. And I think that in a few different ways that I tried to indicate in the talk, that what we have in common is nothing. The nothing that we are, that we are nothing suspended over nothing, and that there's something important and freeing in that, because we're more together, but still nothing, because the nothingness of human togetherness is only the togetherness, right? When you're sitting around doing the hang, I mean, the hang's nothing, right? It's nothing, it's a hang. You're hanging with other people. And I'm suggesting that there's something really important there that tends to get written over by the ways that we get a bit stuck on the degree to which certain nouns or characteristics or histories that we use for ourselves do and don't overlap. I don't reject any of that, right? But I'm trying to lift up something that I think might be often forgotten in our conversations, and that might be helpful for envisioning. You know, I'm especially, of course, concerned, like many of us, with climate crisis, because we're it, right? We're it. This is what we're going to have to work with. And I'm trying to think through what might enable more of that, right? Now, the more historical version would go something like this. I think there's an argument you can make that some of what queerness as a kind of sociality, or as a kind of, you know, we all know there's no such thing as like queer and trans communities in that sense, but there are queer and trans life worlds, I think. And those life worlds were built by people. And they were built by people who in many cases did not have any choice but to embrace abjection. Did not have any choice but to embrace abjection. And that there's something really important there. And, you know, of course, I'm thinking in part about the kind of history that Sylvia Rivera represents when she's taken on the kind of white, gay sort of attitude of like, we're so proud here, we're so, you know, et cetera, and it's kind of emphasizing that, you know, what she is bringing in terms of, you know, her history and politics is a much more expansive vision of what it would mean for there to be something like queer community. And, you know, Sylvia Rivera is increasingly considered a trans saint, right? This is somebody who is in a church. Her remnants are in a church, and in a holy place at least. And, you know, I think there's a few different levels too where we could think about what that enforced embrace of abjection enables. That there might have been something around that that gave a particular kind of power to some of these moments, to some of these people. And that when we run from abjection, when we run from being seen in our in our, our more abject forms, right? The things we don't want people to see, the desires that we wish we didn't have, the moments where we see ourselves in mirrors and we don't like what we're seeing, that there might be something really important in staying with that and allowing for that. We very often want to be seen in certain ways, and that's really understandable, right? Of course we want to be seen in certain ways. Of course I don't want you to see the things I don't like about myself, right? But that there could be something really important in not trying to run from what you might see when you look at me, even if I don't like it. And so I think you can play a little bit there with thinking about what those kinds of experiences then enable in terms of the worlds that people build. That was probably a longer answer than you were looking for.
Okay, thank you. That was great. So for the sake of folks who don't know Sylvia Rivera, I'm just going to say a word about her. So she was a trans woman who was, the scene that you are referencing, I believe, is when she went to one of the very early gay pride events in New York City. At that point, they were called Christopher Street rallies. They're called Christopher Street because that's where Stonewall Inn was, and Stonewall Inn is where the famous rebellion took place. Many people call it a riot, but some of the people who were there, Stormy Delaverre, who was one of the person who threw the first punch, says it was not a riot, it was a rebellion. So at a Christopher Street rally or an early gay pride rally, she wanted to get up on the stage and she wanted to speak to the people there. And the middle-class white gay men who had organized the event and who were a kind of assimilationist in their approach. They wanted the world to recognize they were just like everybody else except for who they loved. And Sylvia Rivera was not like that at all. She was a street person, she was a sex worker, she was, I think at the time she called her, I'm sure at the time actually, she called herself a transvestite. And these straight white guys were embarrassed by her, and they didn't want her to represent the LGB. They didn't include B or T at that time. They didn't want her to represent the lesbian and gay community. They didn't want to let her up on the stage. Well, she was not the kind of person to be held back, excuse me, and she got herself up on the stage, and what she started with is, you all better quiet down now. And then she started telling them, absolutely correctly, that it was people like her who were the shock troops for what they wanted. She was the one that and people like her were the ones that the bigots recognized immediately. People like her were the people that took the abuse and were the front lines and the shock troops for what these gay guys were trying to get for themselves. And she said, don't reject us. Don't turn your back on us. You need us, and you're nothing without us. It was a very powerful speech. Obviously, I'm not quoting, but just to give you a feeling for who Sylvia Rivera was. And yes, she was abject. She was an outsider. She was on the fringes of society. And so, yes, I would say there is something very important to embracing, absolutely essential. If we're going to change the world, we need to pay attention to the people who are excluded. We need to recognize the value of the people who are excluded. Right? So I'm with you there. I also want to point out that there's a push now for people who work with the trans community. That's my area, not theology. That there's a push now to talk more and to recognize trans joy. So being transgender has been defined by the medical community and by the community itself very much for a long time as being outsiders and being miserable in the sex assigned at birth or the gender assigned at birth. The whole definition of how do you get treatment is you have to show up and demonstrate gender dysphoria. Dysphoria, the opposite of euphoria, you have to show that you are abjectly miserable in order to get treatment. And that's been the defining feature. Well, more recently, there's been a book I recommend. It's called Unlivable Lives by Laurel Westbrook. And she talks about how a lot of organizing, and we could say this about queer organizing to some extent, has been organized about all the bad things that happen to us, all the ways that we're discriminated against. And what that has done to a lot of people who, her book is about the trans community, but again, we could say this about the queer community, which is a larger community that overlaps a lot, but not entirely. I appreciate that you say queer and trans. A lot of people say queer and they include trans. Not all trans people are queer by any shot. But one of the results of focusing on being abject, being outsiders, being discriminated against, is that people start to think that they can't have a good life, that they can't succeed, that they can't thrive. Especially vulnerable are young people who don't see themselves as being able to live past the age of 35, because all they hear about is Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is all about all the people who've been murdered and been killed for being trans. And they hear about gender dysphoria and misery, and you're unhappy and your life is terrible. Well, so now there's a push to say, let's talk about transgender joy, okay? Not that we should ignore all the things that go wrong and all the ways that life is bad and all the ways that we are excluded, but we should also look at all the ways that people thrive and all the ways people take that abjection, form some kind of community, and feel strength in that, and reclaim concepts that have been held against us. All right? So, queer is part of what you've been talking about. I'm looking around the room. There's lots of people in this room who are old enough to remember when queer was a really ugly word. It was a really nasty, ugly thing to say to somebody. And people who were abjected by being called queer at a certain point turned around and said, no, you can't do that to us anymore. We're proud of that. We're proud of how we're different. And we're going to claim it for ourselves. And so here we can have a lecture where queer is a good thing, and we're talking about it in nuanced ways. So thank you for that.
I mean, one of the most fascinating moments in thinking about how some of these languages change and what they mean differently. I think it's going to be interesting to see how gender euphoria circulates in the next few years, because it's possible that it's maybe not a super good idea to tell teenagers that being trans means you're suicidal, basically, right? It's possible that maybe that's not the best message to give, especially because, as we know, some of these suggestions, people, yeah, you know the problem, how we should talk about death by suicide. But, one of the times I was in Leslie Lohman, which is the sort of now not just gay anymore sort of museum in New York, there were some of these folks who were leading a walkthrough who talked about, and the older gay men who had been around in the scene for many, many years, and who said, when the word queer came along, we didn't like it because it took the sex out, right? And of course, it's just fascinating, right? What the kind of semantic reference is of some of these terms for different ones of us, right? And how quickly, of course, that also changes, right? But one of the things I think that's been particularly characteristic, and you could speak to this much more accurately than I, of the degree to which medical authorities have sought to control access to some of the particular means of medical transition for trans folks, is that it has been so necessary to build these networks of circulation, right? Access to hormones, or, when you run out of hormones and you haven't gotten your, and that there's a real sort of, there's a kind of generosity that emerges there, to have nothing in common might also, in a certain sense, mean to have everything in common, right? And I think about, in some of Casey Plett's stories or something like that, when, she's walking down, one of her trans women protagonists is walking down the street and she's just, giving her sweatshirt to somebody, and she's like giving her money to somebody. She has no money, she's giving her money to somebody, and how much that matches some of the communities that at least I've sort of seen around me, and the practices that come from that there's something particular. What Sylvia Rivera was doing with some of the money she earned from sex work was giving shelter for trans youth who were on the street, right? So that they didn't have to do that work.
She started an organization called STAR, Street Transvestites
Action, and then what's the?
I don't remember what the R stands for.
I don't remember the R either.
And with Marsha P. Johnson, and they supported the organization. It was for street kids, to get them off the street, trans kids off the street, and give them shelter, because these kids had no place to sleep. And I don't know if you know this story. There's a funny story about they had, I can't remember if it was a bus or a truck that they had converted into a place to stay. and they parked it illegally. And all of a sudden, one night, it started to move because it was being towed away for being parked illegally, and there's these kids sleeping in it. Oh no! Yeah, but anyway, that's how they supported it. So the business about having, are we running out of time?
Well, let's make this last observation.
I'm fine if we want to open it up to questions now. We can go on, but we can go on later.
Yeah, so we have about 25 minutes left, so why don't you keep that in your back pocket? And now we can take questions from the audience. I think we have one mic here and maybe another mic. Oh, a second mic up there. So just get my attention or Scott or B's attention.
There's one over there.
Yeah, there's a question in the corner. Scott?
Scott, behind you.
We need those microphones on there. Should be good now, Scott.
Test.
There we go.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. There's lots of just great ideas here, and I'm particularly drawn to this notion of queer theology as learning to live with the threat of otherness. So returning to the notion of theology that you were working with, I'm struck by the presence of the divine as a kind of a horrifying otherness, an otherness that might kill the self, this thing that you can touch the altar and it might strike you down. So there's that sort of a threat at play here, this holy threat. But the kind of threat of this holy other, it's a lot bigger than the threat of the queer other before me, maybe the queer other of myself. So I'm wondering if you could kind of play out the textures of threat in your account. If you'd be able to speak to how threat might filter through in different ways between maybe a divine threat versus the threat of otherness in these smaller political ways.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and I won't be able to say nearly the kind of thing that it ought to invite. But one of the things that you're really beautifully pointing out is that in a lot of theology these days, we tend to make God, I've called it a strategy of corrective projectionism, where we take some problem in human existence and we're like, yo, that gets solved in God, right? Humans have these problems, but that gets solved in God. And then we just kind of project that right back down and say, now it's kind of, and there's a real, what we might think of as a kind of domestication of God that's happening in that, if God is, which may or may not be a sentence, right? Then God is wholly other, right? And I think that can and should be experienced maybe also as threat, right? Because there's also, have you ever had an experience where something horrible happened or what felt really overwhelmingly awful at the time? And then maybe over time, your relationship to that changed in some way and it got integrated into your life in some way that you had not at all expected? And how important experiences like that can be. And we don't know in advance which experiences are going to go which way, right? There are losses that cannot be made good. But there are also experiences where something in us gets shattered. I had an experience like that once where I was just showing up. I had sort of a kind of, I can be a tough guy, kind of, this is my, and I had a kind of devastating loss in my life. And I was showing up on people's doorsteps like a drowned kitten, just like, here I am. And, that experience was incredibly awful at the time, right? It involved, months of weeping and, I felt like my life had completely fallen apart and had to be rebuilt from the very bottom. And unfortunately, it turns out that my life got way better afterwards, which is also kind of heartbreaking in a way, right? But you don't know. And so I'm thinking, there are some valences of threat or of fear in particular, I think, that may be circulating like that. And then there is also the genuine threat that the other is. We do harm each other. But I worry when we moralize the harms that belong to our animality in certain ways. Because breathing in the presence of another person is the condition of possibility of bodied life. And so to make that then in the ways that we have maybe risked doing, and in particular to tell only the stories of failure as we sometimes are tempted to do, because as I was learning in the class I attended earlier today, bad news is what kind of sells, right? Good news is no news. And I think we see that all around, that there are stories of real relations that are non-threat, or where threats turn out not to be threats, that aren't getting told. And I'm sort of hoping that we might tell more of them with each other. That's moving a little too far from where you're going, but yeah.
In some sense, you're celebrating kind of a theology of surprise.
Yeah, and some of what emerged from me during this, that's exactly. I worked very hard not to be surprised during the early part, especially of the pandemic. I am the child of an epidemiologist mother, and I am the occasionally faithful child of the university. So my desire for knowledge ran rampant, right? Oh boy. Because I was trying really hard to figure out what was probably going to happen, because the ways that what was happening was being talked about around me did not seem at all to match onto my understanding of how people move in relationship to each other, or of what kinds of spaces people encounter each other in, and the consequences that has when the virus that is circulating spreads before symptoms, right? That everyone, everywhere, meatpacking plants, favelas, high-rises, would have had to do this all the time for some period, that even one or several escapes, tiny little things eventually would seed, just as happened at the beginning. It just didn't seem that human and animals work like that. And so I worked very hard not to be surprised. And that's when I really value surprise. Mm-hmm. Right? Because surprises that are easy don't really count.
Mm. There's one, yeah. Actually, there's a caller right there in the corner.
Oh, no, I'm just waving.
Oh, you're just waving, okay. Then Riley's got a question.
Hi, thank you so much for that. Incredibly thought-provoking. The word that kept coming up for me during the talk, which you didn't use, but it was a very theological one, was grace. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what you think about this counter-ethics to what we experienced during the pandemic as an ethic of giving each other grace.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So in the writing that I'm currently doing, Grace, Mercy, and Forgiveness, the parts that I'm working on that I took the latter part of this from, Grace, Mercy, and Forgiveness, words that I had, and we could go to Scott on some of this, but words that I had never really thought were going to circulate positively like that, because I've tended to be so concerned about the violences that terms like that threaten to conceal. But what I've been starting to recognize, and I started to recognize this because people kept telling it to me, right? Sometimes other people give you things you don't want. And that's amazing and also kind of irritating, but it's amazing. And so it was almost being, they were coming in. I couldn't keep them out anymore. And I started realizing that my concern with how much violence terms like that can sometimes conceal was robbing me of the ability to tell the difference between the forgiveness that is an absolutely necessary condition of human existence, because I will fuck up, I guarantee it, right? And, forgiveness that is this kind of, just loosen something into the air, or grace that is sort of, well, people who already have everything get everything, right? But, again, Marcel Althaus-Reid, this queer theologian, has this line about nothing for free or for grace, that's the kind of threat of what she calls capital T theology. In capital T theology, there's nothing for free or for grace. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means for there to be, something for grace, or for there to be a mercy, for there to be mercy in human life, an unexpected kindness, a fuck, a moment of connection you didn't expect, The rave is a mercy. You could think of different kinds. So yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Andy, and then there's some woman in, I think, in the right near B. So Andy first.
Sure. Great, thank you. I also have a question about terminology.
Mm-hmm.
You just spoke 5 or 10 minutes ago about how we are all nothing and what we do is nothing. You began your address today by saying we are all flesh, which strikes me as something. So what do you mean by nothing, and why is it important that we understand that?
That's a great question. So part of what I mean is flesh is like grass. It withers and dies. And I don't mean that flesh is nothing in the sense of, I'm not nothing here decidedly is not intended to signal something like valueless, right? It's decidedly not intended to signal something like, oh, you're just nothing. It's trying to signal something else, this idea of the nothing in common, that what we have in common might be something like our death, but that also means our life, right? And I'm also I am playing on some language that, you might find in Kohelet or in the book of Ecclesiastes around, this again, like flesh is like grass, and the difficulty that it is to sort of sit with that. Implicitly here, there's a pretty big critique going on of how the university relates to knowledge. Because one of the things that really got to me during the worst of this period, and it was, I think it has been a very different experience for different people, was the way that the people who were participating in the kinds of dynamics I was trying to describe most actively were my friends and colleagues in fields who were talking about human animality and who were talking about the need to overcome the vision of the liberal subject that lies at the heart of racial capitalism, which is the subject that has property in itself and can own itself and in so doing control itself. And if we think or recognize that humans are animals, which is obviously the case, why would we imagine that we could somehow become masters of our actions in this way? It just is not possible for intentionality to be present in a human being with that degree indefinitely. What it meant to turn away from people as a way to show care, teaching ourselves that, right? The moments when I would notice that I had been talking in somebody's direction for 90 seconds outside and needed to make sure that they were not downwind from me or that I moved downwind from them. That is not a way that human beings can interact with each other indefinitely, but you know who's really good at interacting like that? Those of us who are creatures of the university. Because we are trained in the practice of deferral. We are trained in the practice of a certain kind of knowledge, which is a knowledge that I think it turns out, right, in these dynamics where those who know, and this was a particularly violent experience in the United States. I don't normally use violence like that, so it's interesting that it's coming out. But the people who lied to me for my own good, the people who told me in March in New York City not to put on a mask, I will never forgive that. Never. I know I should, but I don't know how, right? I don't know how to forgive that kind of betrayal. And so, that doesn't, it moves us away a little bit from this question of nothing, but it has something to do with the way that the objects of knowledge are somethings in a certain sense. And we are perhaps not so organizable under that as these ways of trying to know us tend to assume.
There's a question here.
Hello. I have two questions. One is that when you say nothingness, is there any Buddhist notion of nothingness? Whether you have been influenced by the Buddhist concept and understanding all the history of profoundly learning about nothingness. And the second question is, as a person who are in the intersection of race and queerness and faith and everything, right? When you're not a white person, for example, but there is always the kind of the tendency that some kind of assimilation. So when you say that the community of having nothing in common, of those who have nothing in common, actually liberates some of us, because we don't have to then agree to the assumption that we should have something in common and then accept the assimilation based on the similarity or commonness, at least 1%. So I think that your notion of, or even the kind of introducing the concept of the community of those who have nothing in common, I think it's some way liberating and then healing and then giving the room for those who don't want to be always feeling that have the pressure of being assimilated to proudly say that, oh, I'm free.
No, that's beautiful. On your first question, definitely yes. And because I'm in the study of religion, there's no way I will talk about that. But just not yet. I'm not there yet. But yes, definitely. On the second one, I grew up as the child of an Iraqi mother in Norway, right, in the 80s. And my mother was assimilating as hard as she could, right? She was trying so hard to become Norwegian in certain ways. Her Norwegian, you would have no idea that she wasn't a native speaker. She refused to teach us Arabic because she was working so hard to, learn Norwegian. And, her experiences with the racism of white men really influenced the ways that she interacted with me. And I will tell you now a story. I love my mother very, very, very much. When I graduated from college, she offered me a choice of funding some language study in Berlin, a place where I really wanted to go and spend some time, or a nose job. Because that was how she was showing love in her mind, right? And yeah, it did take me some years to forgive that one, but that one I have definitely forgiven. I've come to understand more. So yes, absolutely. I mean, there's room for a discovery, right? That we might find other points of connection we don't know until we try. Yeah. There's a hand in the back.
But I'm feeling badly about Bia because I think she hasn't had a chance to pass her microphone off. It's for Pate. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. A theme that kept on coming up for me during your talk was this idea of fear of change, fear of contagion, ultimately fear of death, right? And it seemed like what I was hearing from your talk was that there was a pathway to the other side of that, right? But it wasn't, it wasn't being moored in our faith and reason. It was more initiatory, right? And I guess my question is, it seems like today that sort of initiation that's coming out of the closet into the life, as it were, is dramatic. Or is it, and my question is, do you agree with that assessment? Is it necessarily so? Or what are the vectors into that sort of initiatory learning that you think can come to the other side?
Yeah, there have been a few different versions of this talk, obviously, over the last some months. And in one of them, I talked about the difference between inclusion and being open at the edges. Because sometimes when you try to bring someone in, they might not want to come in, right? But being open at the edges and sort of, that you can come in if you want to, but you have to want to. And you might also be coming into a place that already exists in some ways, where there are people there already, right? And as some of you have heard me talk about already, I think about this in really literal terms through the dance floor, right? When you walk onto a dance floor, there's people there already. And you have to, adjust in order to be able to engage with them in less violent ways. And, sometimes the people you meet there might read you for filth and it hurts, right? They might tell you, I see what you're doing and I don't like it. And that might actually be a gift, because we do each other no favors when we don't remind each other that we are here too. We do each other no favors when we let some of these things, we're afraid of it, and understandably so. We're afraid of talking to each other in these ways. But sometimes it might turn out that would be the kindest thing we can do. Not always. That's the risk. So yeah, I just want to pick up the trauma question. I think it can be traumatic. The kind of thing I'm talking about can definitely be difficult and does absolutely involve change. that we don't expect. But I am not so much thinking of the kinds of things we mean by trauma, if that makes sense. Okay, no, but...
Second last question. So we'll have a question up at the top of the stairs, and then Aaron has the last question.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about how early in your talk you talked about the tension between critique and being able to imagine the better. And I think about the particular existential threats facing the queer community in this country and around the world right now, and where the possibility is there for the better. Because I hear in what you're talking about beyond inclusivity, maybe an image of the comprehensiveness of God. We could talk about a lot of things along those lines, but the problem is that each of us have these different ideas of the comprehensiveness of God. Mm-hmm. Each of us have these different special revelations of the self that other people cannot see. And so suddenly a trans woman is a threat, or even someone perceived as a trans woman is a threat. I think of a commenter who was anxious about the title of your talk, speculating that as well as being tainted by Americanness, you might be tainted by being AMAB. You know, we have these good and evil things that we carry around with us. And how do we get to the better thing there? And maybe I'm asking you to solve the problem of religious pluralism. And I would say that being trans is maybe more like a religion than we might like to admit. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a great question. And the one place that I would want to hear more about what the language of existential is doing here, because as I understand existential risk, it means risk of extinction. And I would not describe the current situation, horrendous though it is, as that. That might be a disagreement that we might potentially have. I am a strong believer in disagreements because I think that allows us to see where we might find ourselves and figure out whether there might be some ways that we're in the world together. As far as so I was told, I ran into a prospective student on campus a few weeks ago. And the student told me, and clearly because they were quite worried about this, that there was a TikTok of me circulating where I say something like, I don't argue for the inclusion of trans people in the church. And of course, the context in which I'm saying this is queer and trans people have always been there, have been there from the very beginning. And there's no way that I would take up that question and argue on something where there is no legitimate disagreement, right? But of course, it might read like the scary other thing. And I did hear that apparently some of this read like the other thing. And I'm sorry, this is why I normally don't make jokes in public, right? Because they do go wrong, and I see that. Yeah, but you know, there's also, I think a lot about what it means to learn from experience. Because learning from experience is also what helps us to tell the difference. What somebody says when they're a unknown person that you've never met or you think you've never met, versus if I've seen you and how you move through space and how you pay attention to other people, and you say something I think is strange, or maybe I thought you were scary, and then I see how you move and I'm like, oh, you're not, I don't mean anyone in particular, I just mean any you. And it changes what becomes possible between us. And so I will admit that I'm going increasingly analog on some of these things because I have to see more of who I can trust to share their perspectives and who is maybe trying to make the world worse, which I do think is a real thing too.
So we have time for one more question and then we'll have to call it quits.
Last comment?
Or last comment.
I wanted to take us back to the title of your talk. And you answered half of my question just now. And so the title, oh, that's not it. The title disappeared. Queerness is not inclusive, and the church shouldn't be either. So I think you just explained very nicely the church doesn't need to be inclusive because we're already there. I think that's what you just said.
Well, and some people don't want to be there, and there's more to that.
Those who want
to
be there are already there. So what I was wanting you to expand on a little bit was the first part of it, is why do you say that queerness is not inclusive?
One part is the political answer, right? The sense of queerness, that's one version of that is the sense of queerness that's functioning there. You know, in the classic article where Kathy Cohen makes this point about the nearness or distance from power, punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens on the radical potential of queer politics, ? And if you haven't read it, run and read it. It is a classic for a reason. She talks about the way that queerness by itself may or may not determine your relation to power, that it may be that in particular, this is the period where the language of welfare queens that was used to stigmatize Black mothers was circulating, that it might be that a quote unquote, and heavy on the quote unquote, straight Black mother has a very different relationship that would be in a coalition. And, you know, she's not too sure about the phrasing queerness. She goes a little bit, the question is kind of, can queer politics recognize that and change what it's doing rather than imagining its task as fighting for, you know, at that time, something like, you know, the visible inclusion of gay men in the military or something like that. So that's the one part of that that's going on. And the other part, I think, is that I have become really interested as I encounter many students who have come into queerness and transness, but not yet into queer and trans life worlds, and who don't know that there are inheritances here waiting for them. And I don't think inclusive is quite right there, because I'm trying to avoid the contrast between inclusive and exclusive. The door is open, you can come in, but you might have to want to, or you might have to actually walk through the door. There might not be a kind of, and so, you know, what people mostly think of when they're using this terminology is, if you're queer, you're queer. Yeah, of course, right? I'm not contesting that. But I'm more interested in what people do together than anything else.
Interesting that you just said that they often don't know what they're walking into. And of course, part of my introduction, or Paul's introduction of me, emphasized that I am the founder and run a Transgender Archives, which is the largest such in the world. And that's all about making it possible. You have to walk through the door, making it possible for queer and trans kids, and people of any age, in fact, to know how we got to where we are today, because there's been very little of trans history that has actually been written. And the archives is the original materials that people use to write that history from and to learn that history. And I teach courses, and it is not surprising, but it is still astounding how little people know of the community that they claim for their own, and the identities that they claim for their own, or how we got to where we are today. The young people, I find, are very, very desperate to know their history. They very much want to know their history, but they don't know where to find it. And they, of course, like all of us, don't know what they don't know. So,
like all of us, indeed.
Like all of us. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
And all of you.